we started out looking at this video about the Star of Bethlehem that was on Fox Nation, and they were looking at some pretty weak stuff about what the Star of Bethlehem might have been, and they were looking in like 5, 6, 7 BC. And so we were kind of using that to illustrate that where does that come from? It all comes down to people think that Herod died in 4 BC. And they think that because they've heard it, and it's asserted rather dogmatically. And if there's any citation, it usually goes back to late 19th century historian, a German historian named Emil Schurer. And so people will just say, Herod died in 4 BC, footnote Schurer. And he just asserted it. And we looked at why he might have come to that conclusion. We looked at the writings of Josephus, which is where we get everything except what's in Matthew that we know about Herod pretty much comes from Josephus. But he didn't have the same calendar that we had, and so you kind of had to piece together what he was referring to. You have some kind of known points in history and then counting years of reign. And so we were looking at how one might arrive at 4 BC, but also why that wasn't correct, because when we looked at the date of when Herod started to rebuild the temple, in one place Josephus said it was his 15th year of reign, and in another place he said 18th, and we used that to determine Emil Schurer must have been counting the wrong way, and so he arrived at a date that was about 3 years earlier than reality. So that was what we got through last week. Overall here, we're looking at the gospel account in Matthew and Luke, and do they conflict with one another, which is sometimes claimed, and do they conflict with other historical evidence? And we're going to see that they really don't. If you properly understand what's being referred to, it all fits. So what you have is, on the one hand, you have skeptics that say that the Bible is wrong, that this is like a made-up story. And on the other hand, you have Christians who believe the authorities that state that Herod died in 4 BC, and so they think Jesus must have been born before that. We're also going to look at this census.
Jesus be born before Christ?
Well, those dates were determined. Even when we looked at the astronomy of when the Star of Bethlehem was, we came up with a couple years before. Our calendar system didn't actually start that year. It started centuries later. They might have been off a little, but were they off 5, 6, 7 years? No.
I just want to say it was said by a gentleman named Saint Dionysius, and we know that he's a little bit off now.
Yeah, but he wasn't 7 years off, right? So that all comes back. I even saw it this week, something that stated that Jesus was likely born in 4 BC. It doesn't say why it says that, but we know that it's because of that Herod thing. People accept that as truth, and it leads to other errors. So today, we're going to especially focus on the census that's mentioned at the beginning of Luke 2. A lot of times at Christmas time, when we want to read the Christmas story, we often start at the beginning of Luke 2, and we read about this census, Caesar Augustus, and it mentions that it took place while Quirinius was governing Syria.
Was he good? Quirinius?
No, not really. I mean, this is what this is a historical marker. Luke is saying this happened when this census was going on. What census? There's lots of censuses. He's talking about the one that Caesar Augustus decreed that involved all the world, and that it happened first because this was a first of its kind census, that it happened while Quirinius was governing Syria. So the question is, first of all, what are they talking about when it says census? In the King James Bible, a lot of these words that, like under what's in blue there, are translated as a tax, that Caesar Augustus decreed that all the world should be taxed. And that is not really what the Greek words mean, but it can be associated. When you take a census, it might be related to a tax, but not necessarily. So the translators at that time were interpreting or assuming that this was a tax-related census, but we're going to find out that this particular census was not tax-related. But sometimes these same words can be used when they are related to taxes, but just not necessarily. Dan?
The way that they said all the world, well, it wasn't all the world.
It's all
just in their world.
It's all the empire.
Yeah.
It's everyone under Augustus's jurisdiction.
It's just kind of funny the
Yeah.
way
So he's talking about, as opposed to a more targeted census, this one applied to the entire empire. That's what he's saying.
This was
And this was
Augustus's world, just like
Yes.
Jesse Waters says, this
right.
is my world.
Because Augustus can't order a census of people outside of his empire.
Right.
That wouldn't make sense. So in this context, we're talking about the world under Augustus's rule.
Right.
So the words here that I've got like in blue above it, the Greek, you see it's got the word graph in it. So there's a noun and a verb that are basically the same word. In English, we have this where we have a verb, record, and a noun, record, or recording. That's what we're talking about. The graph part means to write. That apo before it, it's a preposition. It kind of literally would mean like write off, but in English, it's more similar to write down, right? So when you say that somebody wrote something down, that means something a little different than if you just say that they wrote it. Write down means to record or to write something that somebody else said.
It's action. It's action.
Yeah, but it's like more specific. It means to take a recording. So these words are translated here as registered as the verb and census as the noun, but it could be registration. In this case, we're going to find out this is just a head count of everybody in the empire. So what is that referring to? There's,
reminds me of the census every 10 years.
yeah, it is similar to our 10-year census, right? What is this referring to? What census? Some people point to an 8 BC tax census and think that that's what is being referred to here, because those occurred on a regular basis every 20 years. And so that's kind of the closest one here. Why are they looking at that? Well, again, they think it happened before 4 BC. In general, Rome would take a census about every 5 years. And this particular tax census would happen every 20 years. But that census in 8 BC and the ones that occurred on a 20-year interval, they were specifically and limited to Roman citizens. It was a Roman citizen tax census. And so there would be no reason for that to apply to Joseph, that Joseph, not being a Roman citizen, wouldn't have been involved with that census. And then there's another census associated with Quirinius that took place in AD 6. But that one, we'll find out, it is mentioned in the Bible, but it was a property assessment and it was limited to Judea. That wouldn't be something like the whole world as is described here.
Would
that
that
was
be a Jewish
it was
property assessment?
yeah, we'll find out. But it's Quirinius was involved with it. It is called a census with this same word, but if you dig in a little deeper, you find out it was specifically in Judea and it had to do with property assessment. So it wasn't a census in the sense of counting people, but it was a recording, an account of
Wasn't
assessment.
Judea the northern part of
Judea is like where Jerusalem is and Bethlehem.
South Park.
Okay.
So the 6 AD census, we read about that briefly, it kind of mentioned in passing in Acts 5. We had looked at this when we were going through Acts a few months ago. The apostles were preaching, the Pharisees didn't like it, they wanted to kill them, and then one of the older, best respected Pharisees stood up. His name was Gamaliel. We find out later in Acts, Paul says he was his mentor, but he stood up and talked some sense into them and said, look guys, this sort of thing happens where somebody shows up and they kind of get people riled up, and then when they get killed or whatever, everyone else just kind of, it comes to nothing, right? And one of the examples he uses, he says, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census, that's that same word, and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. So he's using this historical example that we'll find out was this Quirinius census from AD 6. And he was trying to tell them, don't kill the apostles, just let them go. And if they're from God, then we shouldn't interfere.
Yeah.
But if they're not, it'll just kind of putter out on its own. And so the Pharisees said, oh yeah, great idea. Let's beat them and imprison them. And,
Still beat them though.
Yeah. So, but he did talk them down from killing them at least.
In that occurrence.
Okay. So in Josephus's writings, we read also about this Judas character and associated with the Quirinius taxation of 6 AD. So in the Jewish Wars, he mentions it briefly. You get a little more detail in Antiquities of the Jews. He says, moreover, Quirinius came himself into Judea, which was now added to the province of Syria, to take an account of their substance and to dispose of Archelaus's money. Now, Archelaus was who was put in charge of this region at Herod's death. And by this time, which is less than a decade later, he's out. So it didn't go well for Archelaus. And now Quirinius is sent in to sort of sort things out, right? He's sort of cleaning up the affairs, the fallout from this disgrace of Archelaus. So he's sent in there to take an account of their substance, their land, and give an account of their estates, it says. And then it's mentioned that this Judas became zealous to draw them into a revolt, and he was trying to get people, he was saying, hey, this is like slavery. So this is clearly the same event, right? Yeah. And then he also says that when Quirinius had now disposed of Archelaus's money, and when the taxings were come to a conclusion, which were made in the 37th year of Caesar's victory over Antony in Actium. So this is one of those reference points. We know that happened in 31 BC. So this puts this in around that 6 AD. It doesn't put it in 2 or 3 BC, right? But this was clearly limited to Judea. It was a specific task he had to go in and deal with Archelaus's affairs, and it was about land assessment. It wasn't about counting people, and it didn't apply to the whole empire. And Luke, remember, he wrote Acts also, so he's aware of this. The idea that he would have gotten mixed up and confused a local property assessment with a worldwide census, that's kind of a silly notion. So what was this census? Well, there's a new census that took place in the 3 to 2 BC time period that was an inventory of the entire empire. It's called the Brief Summary of the Total Empire. I've got it there in Latin. Breviarium Totius Imperii. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but this was a new thing that hadn't been done before. It was to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Augustus's reign, which began in early 27 BC. It was also, he happened to be 60 years old as of September of 3 BC. And it was also the 750th anniversary of the Roman Empire. And on February 5th of 2 BC, the Senate voted to give Augustus this new title, which meant father of the fatherland or father of the country. So he was given even a higher title and status than he already had.
So it's higher than Caesar Augustus?
Yeah, Caesar Augustus, he's already been ruling for 25 years. And before that, he was ruling, but not the entire empire. But now they're giving him this, they're basically giving him an even higher title.
What was
and
the title?
Pater Patria, father of the fatherland. They're basically saying he's it.
Patria.
All of these things are coming together, and he is taking an inventory sort of for bragging rights, an account of all of the resources of the empire. And then he writes about this in his autobiography. He wanted a record of...
Whose autobiography?
Caesar Augustus.
Oh, he wrote an autobiography?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. This census was the first of its kind to have like a state of affairs for the entire empire. How many people, anything. It was like a total inventory of all of their resources. It hadn't been done before. They had various censuses, but this was the first of its kind. And so that's why in Luke, this census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. There may have been other such censuses later, but this was the first of this sort. And I put while in brackets there. I forgot to mention this. So because of the confusion about Quirinius and the 6 AD census, sometimes you'll see a footnote or maybe even the translation itself that will suggest that maybe this word while ought to be before, as if we're talking about a census that took place before Quirinius was governing Syria, because we know that he was governing Syria beginning around that 6 AD part, but that was actually his second term, we'll find out. That wasn't the first time that he was governing Syria. But if you miss the first time and you're trying to make sense of this sentence, this statement, People, unfortunately, will try to twist the scripture a little bit to try to make it fit with what they think is known of history. But even the word while, that's not literally in the text. Like, there's no word that's translated from. And we've talked a little bit here about how Greek works. Like, when you say of the Jews, that's called a genitive case. The word of isn't there. The suffix of the word will imply the of. So the syntax is a little different in Greek. And this word Quirinius here is genitive case. So it's kind of like it means related to Quirinius. But if you were to say before, you would need a word to clarify that. Yeah. So if you sort of looked at this, it's like this census first took place related to Quirinius governing Syria. You know, there's nothing in there about before.
Is that kind of a fill word?
It's because our syntax in English is a little different than Greek. So Greek, some of those filler words were built into the word itself based on a suffix.
You see in the Bible, you see a scripture, and then there's ones that's kind of smaller.
Yeah.
It's like they were put in to help.
That's true. That in King James and New King James, those words are in italics, which is nice. This word is not in italics because it's kind of built into the word Quirinius. Those often involve, when we're talking about genitive case, of or from. They're kind of these little prepositions and stuff. But before, you need an actual word to communicate that. It wouldn't just be included in a genitive case. That temple down there, I just put on there for some pictures. But that had been in the works and was inaugurated or dedicated in 2 BC related to this event of Caesar having his 25th year and getting this new title. So do we have evidence that Quirinius did in fact govern Syria before that 6 AD time period? For a long time, we didn't. And so it was sort of an argument from silence to say that the Bible's wrong because we didn't have contrary evidence either. We were sort of in the dark. But there's some discoveries, even from the 1900s, that reveal that he was governing in that time period. This is called the Titulus Venetus. It's an inscription, but it's in 2 pieces. So that line is denoting where the crack is. So you can see like those words, a few of them. What's on the left there is sort of a diagram version of it, and then a translation of it on the right. And you can see that Quirinius's name is mentioned there 3 times. So what this was a tombstone of a knight. So it was a monument to this knight, and it kind of had an epitaph listing his accomplishments in his career. So his name is up there at the top, Quintus Aemilius Secundus, son of Quintus. So you see in brackets there, they're kind of filling in the parts that are abbreviated. You can see on the left, it just says Q, and then, you know, the translation includes what the Q is short for. So that's why you see some brackets in there and stuff. But you can see Quirinius' name appears 3 times. And it says that this guy served under Quirinius, the legate of Caesar in Syria. It says that by order of Quirinius, I made the census in Apamea, which is in Syria, of citizens, male, 117,000. Now, would that have had anything to do with a land assessment in 6 AD in Judea? No. This is a count of people in Syria, and a lot of people, right?
Well, only men though, right?
Sure, but
I mean, was that the thing? Just go and count the men? Because it says male,
only the men.
117,000.
Sounds
All the
like-
men above 13.
sounds like it.
Really?
Right.
Okay.
But this sounds more consistent with a census of the whole empire, right? So Quirinius, being sort of the local point man here, is in charge of the local part of that census. And that this is not at all related to that census we're talking about in 6 AD. Yeah.
I just kind of have a question. You said it was the men above 13. 13-year-olds would not be, they would still be with their parents, wouldn't they, at that time?
Yeah.
It wasn't.
They usually get married 14, 15,
Yeah.
16.
Okay.
Do we know that though? Like, wouldn't it be possible that Jesus would have been recorded as a baby?
Well, don't boys get their
Well,
bar mitzvah at,
These are good questions.
That's the bar mitzvah thing is a relatively recent advent.
oh, it is?
That's
Actually,
a good point.
in
I thought it was
the
when it comes to man.
in the Bible, in the Old Testament, like the coming of age where you would be able to fight a war and stuff was actually 20. So the whole bar mitzvah 13-year-old is something that's kind of a recent
Okay.
thing. It's not like an ancient
Alright.
tradition. Okay,
That
so
was the age of coming.
These are
in.
good questions. and
They
we
are.
don't really know.
yeah,
We don't know.
some of it we kind of speculate,
Pastor Jeff was preaching one time and he said that Mary was, what, 13?
14.
but we don't know that
We
either.
don't know
I
either.
I doubt it. I doubt that she was that young. But
Yeah.
you know,
Down
Did they
south,
marry that young? Who
the music.
knows? I don't know.
What did you say, Dan?
Down south, by the time they're
Oh,
yeah,
15,
down
I think
south.
Loretta Lynn was married at 15 or something.
Yeah.
so again, trying to sort of pinpoint when is this referring to? Not only we have this mention of the broad census of people, we have this other detail that he was sent on a mission by Quirinius against the Iturians. When might that have happened? Well, in Luke 3, and this is also mentioned in Josephus, Philip, one of Herod's sons, well, in Luke 3, this is not during the Christmas time, but this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He gives some more of these sort of historical points about like what year of reign it was for Tiberius Caesar. And he mentions that Philip was the tetrarch of Iturea. Now, he inherited that position upon Herod's death. So what would happen was Quirinius would conquer certain areas, get them under control for the empire, and then sometimes those regions might be then transferred to Herod for sort of the long-term stewardship of them, right? So if Quirinius had this conflict with Iturea, would that have happened after Herod's death or before Herod's death? If Philip inherited that region,
After.
before.
Oh,
He-
before.
because
Well, that probably
if
started before.
he's not going to attack the Iturians while Philip is running it.
No.
This would have happened before
Oh,
that.
okay.
So we can see that Quirinius was in charge in Syria before Herod died, right? So this isn't in the 6 AD time period. This is in Herod's lifetime. And as we looked last week, Herod lived into 1 BC. If we're thinking that the census happened in 2 and 3 BC, now this fits, right? You have Quirinius in Syria taking a census and also having this conflict at some point before Herod's death with the Iturians because he got it under control, had it transferred to Herod, and then Philip inherited it. So that couldn't have happened after Herod was already dead.
Okay.
Which Herod are you talking about?
Whenever I say Herod, we're talking about the daddy.
Herod the First.
All the other ones,
So
I'll
this is
always
the same
give you another
daddy
name.
Who wanted to
Yes.
kill the babies?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he doesn't have any other name other than sometimes he's called Herod the Great, just for clarity. But any other Herod, pretty much you have some other name that you can associate. Now, in the Bible, sometimes Antipas is just
Yeah.
called Herod.
Yes.
But when I speak, especially since we're talking about the end of Herod's life, Herod means Herod the Great. And if I'm talking about his sons, I'll tell you which son.
Okay.
Just, yeah. So
Which one was married Herodias?
Herod Philip the First. And then she divorced him and married Herod Antipas.
But that's all we're talking 30 years later, so
Yeah.
I could pull up the family tree because it's complicated. I have trouble keeping track of
Just got whacked for-
my own family tree, let alone Herod's. But for what we're talking about Herod the Great. When did he die?
How old was Jesus when Herod died?
Very young.
He was under 14.
It might show the.
Yeah, we're talking he was at most a toddler.
Okay.
Because if we look at what we had tried to get a chronology from the stars,
Yeah.
and that the wise men saw, the first time they saw the star was in August of 3 BC. And the second time they saw the star was in June of 2 BC. That's when they got to Bethlehem. And Herod was alive at that time. And then last week we looked at, there was an eclipse mentioned
Yes.
shortly before his death. There was a full eclipse in 1 BC in January. So Herod probably died in 1 BC. I can't 100% rule out at this point
Okay.
that he didn't die in 1 AD,
So then.
but he was certainly alive as of 1 BC.
Okay, so then who came after Herod?
Well, he had
4 parts.
My.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons he's sometimes referred to as Herod the Great, because he had the largest jurisdiction,
Gotcha.
and then it was divided up. So Philip ended up with Iturea, and if you look on this map here, let's see, can I get the laser pointer?
Now it's clear.
I got some feedback last
Way to
week.
the north.
Stop standing up because we can't see the screen. So
You are 6'10".
this area here,
He didn't stand up.
last week I did,
Oh,
to try to point to things.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
there's a pointer for some of you. This is Iturea. This is Judea. This is Bethlehem, right?
okay.
And this Syria is up here. So
Babylon's up there.
yeah, Samaria, Galilee.
Where's Nazareth?
That would be in Galilee.
Yeah, right there.
I can't.
Oh, okay.
It's
So
small
that's
print, but
far away from Bethlehem, isn't it? Didn't we say 12?
about 100 miles or something
100
like that.
miles?
Yeah. So this is the region we're talking about here, Iturea, which is,
Okay.
next to Syria.
Tom, I got a question about, when Jesus, they took him to Egypt, would there be a record of, did anybody looked at a record in Egypt of his time there?
Not that I know
I'm
of.
just curious.
Well, even the fact that there would have been any record at this time was unusual. Like Luke had written, this was the first of its kind.
No, I just-
I think that God manipulated these wicked men
What you think?
to fulfill his purpose, because Augustus, having this big, let's have a big census to list how great I am, got Joseph to travel with Mary to Bethlehem. So the reason they were in Bethlehem was because of Augustus, although Augustus had no idea that he was basically a pawn in God's plan to have Jesus born in Bethlehem.
Prophecy is fulfilled.
Yeah. And then they moved to, they relocated to Egypt to avoid Herod's plan to kill Jesus.
Yeah.
And when Herod died, they had lived in Nazareth, but then they had lived for a while in Bethlehem too. So when they were coming back from Egypt, the Bible says that they didn't return to Bethlehem because Archelaus was in charge. And he wasn't exactly a non-threat either. So they thought if they went back to Bethlehem, maybe Archelaus would look to kill him too. So they went back to Nazareth, which also he would be called a Nazarene.
Right.
So
Because he was probably about a year and a half, 2 years old, right?
yeah, maybe, yeah. So at this point, Joseph kind of has two hometowns. And when you're going, where should we move back to now that Herod's dead? You're going to go, well, we're more likely to kind of be under the radar if we go back to Nazareth. So here's another inscription that was discovered in the 1900s. This one is called Titulus Tiburtinus, or the inscription of Tiber. These inscriptions sometimes, this is in Rome, but they have etched in stone historical records. And this one here, it's fragmented, it's incomplete. So what we have here is, in the photo, you can see like the part on the left is what actually exists, and what's outside of it is like Wheel of Fortune attempt at solving the puzzle by Gerard Gertou, which we talked about him last week. He's got this great material on this chronology, and I've been using his work as a reference for some of this stuff. But what we do know is that the known part of this fragment talks about somebody, but not by name, because the name part isn't in there, somebody who was twice governing Syria. At the bottom there, it mentions that once more Syria and Phoenicia, like he had held this position and then he had it once more, like Grover Cleveland in America, right? Like he served a second term that wasn't consecutive with the previous term, but it doesn't say who it is. And so he's kind of like filled in the blanks of what the rest of it might have said. But there's other clues in here, and I don't want to get on a big sidetrack because you probably don't know a bunch of details about Quirinius versus Verus versus Saturninus. So to try to figure out, well, which guy is this talking about wouldn't really be of a lot of benefit. But if you want, you could go to his paper and see the other things that are in white there, the events, how they best fit Quirinius of sort of the proposed candidates.
I'm blown away at how much work you put into this.
Thank you.
Good job.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
That's all he does.
It's my primary hobby at this point. It's a lot of fun, but it is daunting sometimes to go, this is like this. Like we could go on a rabbit trail, but it's like just here's somebody was governor twice of Syria, and the clues point to Quirinius as being referred to. But other people have been also. Like the idea that somebody would have served as in a position and then done something else and then come back to that position, that did happen multiple times. That wasn't like even as unusual as
Talk about
in
the
America.
college professors. This is what they hone in on. Tell them. That they they only talk about his second term in office.
Yeah.
Because if they can get you to believe, that he started in 6 AD, then Luke's completely wrong.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So it's an argument from silence. Like we know that he served in 6 AD, but we don't have evidence that he never served before that. And in fact, relatively recently, like in the last century, we find evidence that is in fact the case. There's a similar thing with Pontius Pilate, like what position he held, where, was it prefect or was it...
Don't find yourself in the shoes of Voltaire, where
Yeah.
you're arguing against the Bible because, why don't you believe in the Bible? Because there's no such thing as the Hittites, and the Hittites are mentioned for over 1,200 years in the Old Testament. And then he dies, and 100 years later, they finally unearth the first Hittite city.
Yeah, and so these
But he's in
things,
hell.
people could have said for centuries, well, there's no evidence that Quirinius served in the 2 to 3 BC time period, until there is. And then you find, here is some evidence, right? But it was still true before these 2 inscriptions were discovered.
That's like COVID was never discovered in the lab, but now we discovered that it is.
Yeah, well, the science changed, the history changed, but...
When they did these, that I assume that's a stone, right?
Yes.
Did they date it at the bottom?
Well, it was sort of the same kind of thing where they would often reference somebody's term in office. We'll see another one that is from 3 BC. It's coming up, but it doesn't say 3 BC. But based on what is given, we know it's 3 BC.
Okay.
Or in Greece, they would do it from the Olympics, the last Olympic Games.
Yeah. Or the reign of somebody's, what year of reign. Just like Luke does, like in all that information he gives. Here's another thing. The idea that, there's no evidence that Quirinius served at this time. How about Luke? That's still a historical account. The idea that the Gospels, in particular, Luke was a pretty skilled historian. The idea of just dismissing them as like just making things up, especially in the face of over and over again things that are in the Bible, historical details. Nineveh never exists, and then they excavate Nineveh. Like that sort of thing happens over and over again. So to go in with the starting point that the Bible is to be doubted on its accounts of history, like why on earth would Luke in the 1st century refer to specific people and places that weren't accurate? Like he would get uncovered as a fraud right away because people would go, Quirinius wasn't governing when the big census happened, right? That would, in like the 1st chapter or 2nd chapter of your book, you've just discredited yourself. So that'd be a silly thing to even attempt. So it's a pretty bad argument, and it is an argument for
Ron
silence.
McLean was appointed an elder in January of 2023. But if I said like 2019, right?
Yeah.
At Four Winds Church.
Now you lost me.
Well, he's saying if you're talking to people from that culture
coming
and you're using historical reference points that they would be familiar with of people, places, and dates, it would be silly to use false ones because you would discredit yourself right away. These people would know. When we read about, whatever year of Tiberius, like that doesn't mean a lot to us. But back then, people knew that was, it'd be like saying during Reagan's 2nd term, like now you have a window of time. We're talking about the mid to late 80s. But if you're talking about when, disco was really popular during Reagan's 2nd term, people go, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That was
Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, that was 5 or 10 years earlier, right? So
I hated that thing.
There you go, man.
Okay, so here's another one of these. This is a Paphlagonian inscription, and this was in 3 BC. So Katie, this is an example of how did they reference dates. In this case, we read, in the 3rd year of the 20th consulship of Emperor Caesar Augustus. Now, if you go on to Wikipedia and you look up these consulships and they'll have a chronology, this will take you right to 3 BC. Like this one is pretty specific, right? That's in northern Turkey, Paphlagonia. And so this says that on March 6th, the following oath was taken by everyone in Paphlagonia, and it was an oath of allegiance to Caesar Augustus. And it says that the same oath was sworn by all the people in all the lands at the altars of Augustus and the temples of Augustus in various districts. So this is dated here a few months into 3 BC. Because the censuses took place on about a 5-year cycle, and the father of the fatherland census, the inventory of the world, was associated with early 2 BC, because that's when the Senate voted for that title. I suspect that decision to give him that title was not made on a whim, but that was something that was anticipated and planned for in the year beforehand. So if you're doing these censuses on about a 5-year cycle, remember we had the Roman tax census of 8 BC, so 5 years later is 3 BC. That's when they're about due for some sort of census. So I think that this oath was probably coupled with that inventory. It was probably included in their census was, let's find out how many people are loyal to Caesar while we're counting people. So these might have been one in the same census, rather than having like one in 3 BC and another the very next year. That it would make sense that you're taking this inventory of the world. He knows that this honor is coming and gets a head start of it in 3 BC and includes in that an oath of allegiance along with it. I don't know that 100%, but that seems to fit, that the oath was associated with that inventory census of the whole empire.
When did people start using the term AD?
Same
460,
thing.
St. Dionysius. He came up with a whole new calendar because the Western or the Eastern Roman Emperor wanted to.
Yeah.
What was that calendar called? Julian calendar?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And today,
What?
Julian calendar.
After Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
Yes.
And today we call our calendar the Gregorian calendar.
Gregorian, yeah.
Just a slight change to how we deal
100
with
years later.
just a slight. Well, that was in the 1582.
1100 years later. Sorry, you're right.
It was, and that involved just a slight change in how we deal with leap years, a little more nuanced because the seasons were shifting a little and we had to get it back on track. But effectively, they're the same. There's this 10-day gap in 1582 to kind of like get back on track, but that's a whole. Julian/Gregorian is like our current system of January to December and all that. And then I use the more traditional BC and AD. You see, of course, BCE and CE now. They call it Common Era. You can just call it Christian Era.
Devil.
It's because that's really what it is, right? The Christian Era. Either one, CE means AD, BCE means BC. Okay, so here's a reference to that oath that we read in Josephus. And we can see that the oath to Caesar that we just dated according to that inscription, 3 BC, happened while Herod was alive. So Josephus writes in Antiquity of the Jews, this certain sect of men that were Jews, the Pharisees, we've heard of them, right? They were in a capacity of greatly opposing kings. Accordingly, when all of the people of the Jews gave assurance of their goodwill to Caesar, that sounds like the oath to Caesar, right? And to the king's government, which would be Herod, these very men did not swear, being above 6,000. So there were 6,000 of them that would not give their oath of allegiance to Caesar. And when the king imposed a fine upon them, so as retribution for, pledge your allegiance or pay a fine, right? Pherora's wife, so Pherora was a political rival of Herod's. Okay. So his wife paid their fine. And to pay them back, the Pharisees, who were thought to be able to foretell events, they said that Herod's government would cease and that Pherora would end up ruling rather than Herod's posterity. That never happened. But the point is, the Pharisees refused this oath of allegiance. which we just
The
dated.
Pharisees.
The Pharisees said, we're not.
They finally did something right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, they must have had some money.
Well, I mean,
She did.
She did.
you remember they would confront Jesus. Is it right for us to pay taxes? They didn't like the Romans. They didn't like Caesar, and they weren't really shy about it either. So they wouldn't take this oath of allegiance to Caesar. Because of that, they were fined by apparently Herod. Ferraro's wife paid their fine. So this all happened while Herod was alive. But Herod died in 4 BC. But that oath of allegiance happened in 3 BC. So this is more evidence that Herod was still alive as of 3 BC.
That's what this is about.
Yeah.
In case someone says you don't believe in the
Why didn't you
Bible.
lead with that? No.
No, literally.
Well, that's follow up to last week. We were looking at the chronology, and now here's more evidence that Herod's still alive in 3 BC. At the earliest, right? So we have also coins. Archelaus, Antipas, Philip II, they all reckon their reigns. This is another thing where it's like, well, they all seem to say that they started their rule in 4 BC. Herod must have died in 4 BC. But Herod the Great, even when he first started to rule, remember there was kind of like that 3-year gap between when the Senate said he was in charge to when he actually took power because somebody else was there he had to go to war with first. His first coins that he minted said 3rd year, year 3. So he, even though it was like his first year actually in power, he backdated his coins to go to that earlier date. So there's incentive. If you're a king, you don't want to be the new guy. No one wants to be a rookie. So even if you are the rookie, you're looking for some excuse to say that you've been at this for a few years, right? So Herod the Great did that, and his sons did that too. So
They backdated their stuff.
So Philip II, we talked about him earlier with Iturea. His first coins were minted 3 BC. We don't have any of the coins from any of Herod's sons earlier than year 3. So there is no year 1, year 2 coin.
So they all backdated.
They all backdated. And what were they dating to? They were probably dating back to his first will. Originally, Antipater was going to be his heir. But then very late in his life, he killed Antipater and hurried up and wrote a new will for these other guys. And so they seem to be rendering their
you
reign.
missed that class.
Yeah, he killed Antipater, had to write a new will, amend his will, and then when Herod died, they were like going to Caesar to show him the new will and stuff. But they would consider, apparently, whether it was reality or not, what matters is what they claimed, that they were counting from when he first wrote his will, even though it didn't involve them, it involved their brother who got killed. But no one wants to be the new guy. There's an incentive to date these earlier. And so they would basically count the beginning of their reign from when Herod first wrote a will in 4 BC. So, sort of to sum up here, Herod did not die in 4 BC, but it was most likely in 1 BC. Maybe even in 1 AD, but I think probably 1 BC. The Luke 2 registration, census, refers to Augustus's inventory of the world, possibly including that oath of allegiance, and that's in the 3 to 2 BC time period. Quirinius was indeed governing Syria at the time of that census, and Herod was alive when the oath was taking place. Herod's heirs, like Herod, antedated their reigns by a few years. Yeah.
Would Mary and Joseph have been required to take that oath?
That's a good question. We don't have any record of that. They may have. Yeah, we don't have any record of that. And like I say, I don't even know 100% if the oath was included in that census. We know for sure there was a census of the whole world, and it may have included while they were asking if you would. The thing is, if you didn't, you might get fined. Who knows, right? I mean, what are Mary and Joseph? What does allegiance to Caesar mean? Were they going to revolt and lead an insurgency against them? No. So I wouldn't have faulted them for going.
The first sentence
Yes.
is the big deal.
Tom, were Pharisees...
Swearing by the gods.
Well, okay.
Yeah. Were Pharisees a political group or were they a nation?
Neither. Well, they were
A religious
they were
group.
teachers. They were basically Sunday school teachers.
Okay.
They were,
So they were the ones that had to take the oath, not the general public.
It
right?
looked like everyone did. Based on that Paphlagonian inscription, it said all the men in the city took it. So, but they were the ones that said no. They refused the oath. Other people might have just gone, yeah, whatever, right? I don't know. But we have evidence that this oath existed, that the Pharisees didn't take it, and that it happened during Herod's life. So when you look at Matthew and Luke's accounts, they're not in conflict with one another. It's not that one points to 7 BC, 8 BC, and the other one points to 6 AD. They're both pointing to that 2 to 3 BC time range when Quirinius was ruling Syria and Augustus did order this census. And so it all fits. That's it.